Philip, we have only had a guest repeat one other time, and that was Kevin Carmignani, who shared his personal recovery story, and then he shared about Orca. So I'm really excited this morning that we have a guest we had on previously to talk about her role and passion for life-ring recovery. But today we're going to be able to focus on her new book that's coming out and her personal story. So I'm going to let you welcome Mary Beth.
Well, you just welcomed Mary Beth very beautifully.
I just want you to join in a little.
Mary Beth, do you want to say hello?
Hello. Hi. Thanks for having me.
And who are you?
So, Mary Beth O'Connor, the title of the memoir sort of summarizes the story. I call it From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. All of those words were chosen very carefully, as I think you can imagine. But I say the short version of the story is that childhood abuse led to childhood addiction, right? And so that's, I think, something that many of your listeners will be able to relate to because it's a common path, unfortunately.
You used the word junkie on purpose? How dare you?
I know. Well, and it was for a couple specific reasons. One, of course, the alliteration is great in a book title, but more substantively, I really feel that there's sort of a hierarchy in substance use disorder, right? That it's better to be addicted to alcohol than meth, better to pop pills than to shoot up. And I shot meth, which sort of puts me down near the bottom. And then I see these shows about meth addicts, and it's almost like they're people that should be written off, that it's, pointless to try to help them. They're so far gone. And so I really wanted to connect myself to those people and to that point in their substance use disorder to basically say, she's me. I was her. And with recovery, look what happened. I was able to have a happy and productive life. I was able to become a judge. That we really want to not give up on anyone. We all deserve the help we need to move forward.
Mary Beth, we recently had a phenomena on TikTok where our digital communications manager, Melvin, posted this short clip on somebody who was describing a 31-day run on meth and had a paranoid delusion. It got 3.6 million viewers.
Wow.
And it was really, people were chiming in about he couldn't possibly have been on 31-day run because 11 days is the record. Well, that's without drugs or...
Where's the reporting?
And other people were saying, that sounded like really good stuff. Where could I get some? Other people were saying they're in recovery now, that it's perfectly true what he said. Other people sharing on how long of runs they've been on. What do you think about a viral video about someone talking about a bad trip on meth? What do you think that says?
I'm glad to hear that people noticed. The opioid crisis is real, and we need to focus attention on there, but sometimes the stimulant problem gets overlooked, and there are a lot of people dying from stimulants. Fentanyl's, mixed into stimulants now. The meth is a very strong version now. So it's nice to know that some people pay attention to the breadth of substance use disorder, including the stimulant side. I'm fortunate about the where can I get some, but but the reality is I don't think people realize sometimes how harsh it can be. There are a lot of people that get psychosis. They've actually found now that even in recovery, some people never fully they continue to have psychotic symptoms at some level, even in recovery, or that it can take a very long time for those psychotic symptoms to go away. So it's important that people understand how traumatic to the brain and body meth is. And again, so that we offer them the help that they need and understand that it's a complex recovery. Just because there isn't a physical withdrawal, as in heroin, doesn't mean it's not a complex and difficult recovery.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So you ready to dive in? We talked about, you said, childhood trauma, childhood abuse led to childhood addiction. Give us some more detail. What's the gritty part of that?
The sort of part that was harder for me to see when I was younger was the initial part, which was really a lack of connection to my mother. My mother was actually unwed in 1961 in an Irish Catholic family. This was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
She was actually sent away to this facility that the Catholic Church ran in Philadelphia. We lived in Trenton, New Jersey, that to hide it. And when she had me, my grandparents wouldn't let her bring me home. So I was left at a nunnery for the first 6 months of my life. She said she visited. I mean, I'm sure she did occasionally, and I'm sure they fed me and took care of me. But to me, that's probably where part of the problem started. But even when I lived with her, and I did after the first 6 months, she wasn't focused on me, and she could be violent at times. But the bigger issue arose when she married my stepfather when I was 9, and he was really violent to her. He was violent to me, verbally, emotionally, physically, and sexually violent. I used to minimize it when I was a kid because it was like it didn't happen all the time, but it was that you never knew when. You never knew what would tick him off. When I first moved in there, I tried to figure out the rules. Okay, there are new rules, like you can't go barefoot in the house, which I had been doing in the summer my entire life. All right, you can't call your mother she. I don't understand this rule, but I will try to adapt. But after a while, it became apparent that although I could and did develop strategies to try to reduce the odds of violence, there was nothing I could do to eliminate it. It just really wasn't about me. So it was that walking on eggshells. You could do the same thing 10 times. It would be fine 9 times. And the 10th time you get a beating. I mean, it was just that lack of control, that constant stress that really impacted me at that age.
Were you the only child in the house, or did you have siblings navigating all of this too?
I was the oldest, right, which puts this special extra burden. And my sister is 2 years younger, and then my stepfather had a son. He's 9 years younger. But I was the oldest. I was tall. My sister was tiny, and I was verbal, and so I was really viewed it as my job to try to protect them. It was my job to try to figure things out, to try to develop the techniques. We had a special way of opening the back door when he was sleeping so that we reduced the risk of waking him up. So I did feel that big sister burden of doing what I could to protect the younger siblings.
Did you have anybody you could turn to? As a teacher or?
No. I mean, school was a positive place for me. It was really a positive place for me. I always did really well in school. I got a lot of attention. I got to do special things. When I remember in second grade, in my grade school, the books in the library were organized by grade. You can only take books out in your grade or lower. And my teacher took me to the librarian and told her that Mary Beth can read any book she wants in the library. Like it was a special Mary Beth rule, and that really made me proud. But I think because I had such success at school, nobody was looking for a problem. And I certainly didn't tell anyone because, you're not supposed to tell. I didn't even really tell my friends. My girlfriend lived like 3 doors up, and she knew things were happening, but she didn't understand the severity until we were adults. And when I told her.
Oh, what was, well, let me ask it a different way. Were you successful in your eyes, do you think, in protecting your brother and sister?
I mean, my brother was my stepfather's biological son, so he didn't really physically abuse him, although he was traumatized by witnessing the abuse on his mother and his sisters, right? I mean, there's trauma in just watching.
Yeah.
But with my sister, I certainly many times distracted his attention off of her and, put it on me. He would just look at her, start to focus in on her, and I would say something, mean to him to get him to redirect. And I did develop, as I said, techniques. We had special ways of going in and out of the house and, doing our chores depending on when he was coming home. And so was I 100% successful? Absolutely not. That was impossible. Did I do the best I could as a little girl? I did the best I could, and there was some reduction because I would redirect it.
Wow. It's hard for me personally to identify. I can feel what you're saying and can put myself in your shoes a little bit, but wow, that has to be so difficult. And you seem to have a good attitude about it today, which kind of talks about your recovery a little bit and probably the healing process of writing such a detailed book too, and memoir.
One of the things that you mentioned was that that your addiction or your exposure to substances started at age 12. And I work with a lot of students for whom starting their use all begins around that age in 2022. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions that anybody that young back in the early 70s would be using substances at age 12.
Yeah, I mean, my first drug was alcohol. It was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill Wine,
Oh
which was
my gosh, that
common
The same,
introductory book.
the same generation.
And and also when I was in New Jersey, that's when the drinking age was 18. It wasn't
too.
21,
Me
and
too.
so it was easier to get access. When I had that first drink, it was just such a positive experience, and it was with a girlfriend. But her reaction to it was, well, if it's around, it's around. And my reaction to it was, when can I do it again? Right? Like, how can I get access? I would even risk stealing beers from my stepfather. That's how much I wanted it. But especially when I got to be 13, 14, I leaped older. And so I was going out with older boys and getting invited to older parties, and there was always alcohol. And then surely also I added in pot, which was equally available in that time as alcohol was, sometimes easier to get than alcohol. So it was, it was the first drug. I pursued it right away, but I moved on, added new things regularly.
So talk to us about that. So where did this lead you?
So I added pot, and then there was, we were stealing pills out of medicine cabinets, or people were selling uppers and downers at the time. And then I did a lot of acid my sophomore year. Central Jersey was awash in it. And then when I was 16, I found my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine. And this was really the first big wave of voluminous meth. I mean, meth existed previously, but this is the mid to late 70s. And it was being mass produced for the first time in this way, where it was everywhere. There were biker gangs in Western Pennsylvania that were bringing it in. It was the buzz, like, at least in my area, that it was the first time. It was all over. All the druggy people were excited. Oh, yeah, meth. We're going to be getting more meth, and everyone's trying to get into the distribution chain and get it going. And then when I was 17, I started shooting up meth. So it was a quick escalation. I was in really bad shape at high school graduation.
What were the street names for the meth? Do you remember?
Yes, crank was the big one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we would call it speed, crank, meth. Those were basically the three names that we would give it.
I remember, was there something like Black Beauties or Cross or something like that too in Connecticut? I remember in the 70s.
Yeah, Black Beauties were pills, amphetamine pills, and we would do those if we didn't have access to meth. But definitely we had Black Beauties as well, yeah.
So how are you doing in school still through all the drugs? Because you are super intelligent, obviously, and love to read. Were you still doing that?
I mean, I did well in school up through the very end of my senior year. I basically kept up on my work most of the time. In my senior year, I started to struggle, but I had already by like February or something been accepted to college, so it wasn't really worried about that. Although I didn't get to go when I thought I was, but that's a story for later in the conversation. But once I turned 18 in March of my senior year, they couldn't call home if I didn't show up anymore. And so I really started missing a lot of school at that point, but I'd always been a good student. I told them I was having family problems, which was partly true, and they just let me make up the work. And so I graduated high school with a slight dip in my GPA, but it was already after I had been accepted to college.
And it sounds like something's going to happen here.
Yeah. So I never had gotten arrested as a juvenile, but 2 months after graduation, a month to the day before I was supposed to leave to go to California for college, I got arrested for meth and syringes. And so that was, at first I thought, well, this is it for me, everything's out the window. But they were really easy on me. They let me plead it down to a disorderly person offense, which is below a misdemeanor. It wasn't even a misdemeanor. And then they just gave me probation for a year. And then when I put college off for a year, and I was still on probation, but they let me go anyway to California as long as I filed a report. And in the court order for sentencing, it said that if I didn't get arrested again, I think it was for 3 years, that I could get my record expunged. I didn't have to go through the normal process. I just basically had to file an affidavit saying, haven't been arrested. And maybe they checked, maybe they didn't, but they set it up in advance for me to expunge it. And that's what I did.
So I'm curious, though, what is the scenario that you were arrested? Because that is a traumatic situation on its own.
Yeah, so my friend Bobby and I were sitting, it was like in the middle of the night, of course, we're up on speed. And we were in this park, sort of isolated down a hill. And we were just sitting on the roof of the car talking, and the police came down the hill. We saw the lights coming, but there was no other way out. Like, our foolishness was there was no second exit. And the police came over, and they knew Bobby, and they had been seeing me with the druggy people. I'm sure they knew who I was. In fact, they indicated that. But they searched the car. They made up an excuse to search the car. It was actually not even really a legal search, but they did, and they found the drug, and they charged. Well, Bobby had just gotten out of jail recently, so some of it was his and some of it was mine. But I thought, well, I'm not going to get any more trouble if I just say it's all mine, and so that's what I did as a favor to my buddy Bobby. Yeah.
So already you've been taking care of folks, and sheriff, first sibling arrived on the scene.
Yeah.
I'm also curious as to why you think they took it easy on you.
I mean, I think it was that even though juvenile records, probably were sealed even at the time, it's a small town. They knew that I didn't have a criminal history. I've been in the newspaper twice recently for having the highest SAT score in my class, for getting the most scholarship money in my class. The judge was aware of that. And I was a middle class, white girl. And I just think, his daughter was a year behind me. I just think he looked at me as someone who had gone astray, or these boys, led her down the wrong path. And they just wanted to encourage me to keep going on the positive path that I was. And so they did really take it easy.
And what was your parents, your mom and your stepdad's reaction?
I mean, so, they didn't actually ever say anything about my drug using. My sister and I lived over in an apartment over the garage. And for that summer, my mother never saw me except if I had on this light bathrobe that had 3/4 length sleeves, because that covered up my track marks. And she never noticed, or she never said anything. So they pretended. I think they knew we were doing drugs. Maybe they didn't know the extent of it. I wasn't coming home for days at a time, but nobody said anything. Although when I got arrested, because the car was in their name, they got called, so they could get it out of impound. And when I was released, I was walking through town, and my mother pulled up, and she was just, get in the car. I was like, yeah, I'm not getting in the car here. And I just kept on going. So it was, basically I try to avoid them as much as I could. And she did have a bad beating not long after that, with a hairbrush on my back. I was maybe a week later. It was pretty bad. But those molded plastic hairbrushes, they're pretty seriously hard, right? That broke on my back. It was a pretty significant assault. But she was just angry and frustrated about it. So yeah, that was it.
Oh, so I was going to ask you if the abuse from your stepfather had stopped, but I didn't realize you were also receiving it from your mom.
Yeah, it was much less frequent with my mother, and we never feared for our lives with my mother. So for me, she was in a different category. And I will say, in her defense, when the lawyer told her that I should, show efforts and get treatment, go to a psychiatrist, she did arrange for me to see a psychiatrist, and they did pay for the lawyer to try to help me minimize the impact that this was going to have on my life. And I went to a psychiatrist at Princeton University. So, she tried to find someone skilled, but I told him my true drug history, and he just told me that I had anhedonia and I was depressed, and he gave me antidepressants and never suggested treatment for substance use disorder. So
I've never heard that word. Do you know anhedonia?
What is that?
It's that you're not, you're not able to be happy, that you're, hedonism is a positive, right? It's anti-hedonism, basically. So yeah. So nobody suggested treatment for substance use disorder, even though it was obvious I had a problem.
What I'm just curious, what did your mom and dad do for income? Mom and stepdad.
My mother was a secretary, and my stepfather worked at the steel mill. So I was definitely a blue-collar girl. Like, I'm the person in my family, first person to go to college in my immediate family, and one of the very few even in my more extended family. But yes.
And did your biological dad ever show up or in your life?
So I have three fathers, really. There's my biological father, who got my mother pregnant and abandoned her in 1961. He later, when I was in my 20s, I did meet him. And then when she took me out of the nunnery, it's because she had married the man who became my sister's father. And so she was with him until I was 6, and then they got divorced. And once I was 13, I didn't see him again from 13 to like 53. And we were in somewhat a touch, but not much. And then it was my stepfather. So, and then my mother. So, I mean, I had really 4 parents and none at the same time.
Wow. Wow. All right. Where are we in the story? So is California where you're headed to go to school? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, so I went to college. I started with UCLA and then went to Berkeley. And I did do better with my drug use for the first 3.5 years. I mostly used alcohol, sometimes pills, sometimes coke, mostly on the weekend. Occasionally would run into the week. But for me, it was, I mean, I would used to excess on the weekend, but mostly I kept it contained. So it was an improvement. But I had a really bad multi-assailant rape in college, and then I moved in with a violent boyfriend, and in January of my senior year, I just could not hold it together anymore, and I started using meth again, and I used for the next 10 years. I didn't get sober until I was 32 years old.
Oh. Did you hear what she just said?
I did. And I wish that I didn't. That's the first time I've heard that story. I wish that happens in higher education on our college campuses.
A multi-assailant rape and then a violent boyfriend.
Yes. Although I knew he was violent before I moved in with him, and I did it anyway. It got worse when I lived with him, but it wasn't. There were episodes beforehand, and I thought a lot about that. Why? I could have. I followed him from UCLA to Berkeley because he was going to a college in Northern California. And I was smart enough to say, I'll go if I can get into Berkeley. I'm not downgrading my college for you. So that was good. And I did live with him for the first year, and I could have never, but I moved in with him, and he was really violent. It was just familiarity. It was really, I understood him. We were sort of, we were siblings emotionally. We both had similar damage, and I felt a bond, and I understood him, and I moved in with him. But he got a lot worse when I lived with him, which is common, although I had enough warnings beforehand. And then I just couldn't hang on to my ability to reduce my drug use. I just lost control.
What are you studying in school?
Yeah, I was a history major when I was in college, yes. And I actually got accepted to law school right out of college. I went to Berkeley Law, but I had started using meth again in January. So by the time I got there, I was out of control and I couldn't do it. And I would miss weeks at a time. And so I had to withdraw. And I lost like a top 10 law school because of my drug addiction. I had to withdraw. I knew I was going to fail out if I didn't withdraw. And so that's what I did.
You must have done pretty well to, even through all this trauma and the drug use, to get yourself into Berkeley Law.
I did. I had pretty good grades, and I was working. I mean, I don't have money. My family doesn't have money. I worked like 15 to 20 hours a week, and I did pretty well, in college. I did, but because for 3.5 years, I had better control and somewhat reduced drug use.
And sometimes people don't understand that you can be functioning and have an issue. I mean, even at the end of my addiction, until I lost it, I was holding down a golf professional job at a public golf course, which is, it doesn't always go together, that you don't see.
Yeah, and I had to convince people that I was truly an alcoholic because I had my own practice of the minute I had that, if I was in public, the minute I had that drink where I was pretty sure I was either going to fall on the floor or pass out, I would bug right out of there and get in my car because that made more sense to me. And then I would get up at 4 a.m. to cure the hangover so I could be at work by 7:30. And so people didn't know until I started sharing my story later on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I did hold it together in college, but once I started using meth again, I didn't. I mean, the 10 years after college, I say I worked my way down the corporate ladder because I couldn't hold a job. Every job was less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time because of my addiction. And so I wasn't functional at that point because it was just too far. Using the meth was just me being capable of really being functional. But in college, when I was using less, I was able to manage it.
So what were those 10 years like? Give us some highlights or lowlights, if you call whatever you call them.
I mean, by 32, my body was really starting to have a lot of physical problems because of the meth. And I was really just feeling debilitated and helpless. I had tried during the 10 years a lot of different techniques to moderate, right? I would try to only use on the weekend. I would try to do a 5-day run and then take off for a week, and all kinds of different approaches. Only use a little on the days that I wasn't going to do too much. Yeah, have a real run for 3 or 4 days and then just 1 or 2 shots to keep me going and all kinds of things. And I sometimes could manage it for a month or two, but then I would lose control and go back to daily use. And I had, abscesses and all kinds of physical problems. I was with a partner who, when he met me, we were living apart. I was in Berkeley and he was like an hour away. And he thought I was a weekend user, normal, to have a good time. And I encouraged that impression. I did everything I could to give him that impression. But we moved in together and it became obvious that I had I was in a whole different category. By the time I went to rehab, he was really done with me. He had lost patience. He was really frustrated. He didn't know what to do. And so he was ready to kick me out. I really had no energy to even put a resume together after I lost my last job. I just couldn't do it. So I was really, as we said in my day, tore up from the floor up. I was in pretty bad shape when I went into rehab.
Mm-hmm. And what'd you find in rehab?
So in my mind, I'm, going in for medical treatment, right? And the first day that I was there was a women's program, and it was a 90-day minimum. So it was sort of a longer term program. I didn't think 30 days was going to be enough for me. And I went the first day to the step study that they would do every morning. They would, read a step, then they would either read the big book or the NA text and then talk about it. On the first day there, they were doing step 3, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care, higher power, God of my understanding. I can't remember. And so being the good student I was, I raised my hand and I said, what about me? I'm an atheist. And they did say it does not have to be God. It can be any higher power. And I said, but I don't believe in the higher power. And they were adamant that this was the one and only way. 12 steps was it. There was no other approach. If I refused to find a higher power, if I didn't agree I was powerless, which I didn't like, if I didn't want to focus on defects, which I wasn't happy with, if I didn't comply, I was going to fail. They literally told me, you are going to fail if you don't follow this program. There is no other way. And so that was sort of a big surprise to me that there was only one treatment option being offered when I knew it wouldn't work. And it was a big dilemma. Like, what the heck am I going to do? The experts are telling me to do something I know is impossible. What am I going to do about this? So it was a real stunner of a revelation on day one when I went to rehab.
And what'd you do? How did that resolve or not resolve?
At first, I believed them at first. Well, they're the experts, right? But so I thought about it, and on one hand, it was problematic because I knew I had like 20 years of bad decisions behind me, right? It wasn't like I felt like I could trust my brain. I knew my brain was, chemically changed. I was still in basically detox. And I hesitated to trust my own judgment against the experts, but yet I knew I couldn't do it. So I decided to just look for the ideas that would be useful and ignore everything else. And I took it very seriously. I actively participated in class. I listened to, all the lessons they taught, like the science, some science of substance use disorder or techniques for avoiding and handling triggers. And I read all of the big book and all of the NA text, and I was looking for ideas that I thought would be helpful to me. So, I mean, I really made an effort. Even if I don't agree with all of it, are there pieces of it that I can apply? Is there a core idea underneath this step that she's like the powerless step? I did not agree with that powerless idea. But when I thought about it and I decided what I could agree with is Mary Beth is powerless to moderate. There's no moderating for me, right? And so I did that. I tried to find ways to make it work. But it was still, I was still frightened that maybe they were right, that there was no way. Although I must say, it seemed odd to me. I mean, could it really be true that no atheist in the history of the world has never gotten sober? Like, that seemed unlikely. But that's what they were telling me.
So,
yes.
I'm sorry. I'm really curious about, did you do an investigation of a belief in a higher power before you felt that you are an atheist and that is never going to be an option? Like, had you pursued it previously in your life?
Well, I was brought up Catholic, and so when I was young, I would have said I believed because it's what I was taught, but as I grew up, in my teens, I started calling myself agnostic, after thinking about it and talking with people. It was a big topic of conversation in the 70s, this agnostic thing. But later in college, I realized, no, I'm actually not an agnostic. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in heaven and hell. I don't believe any of that. And so that decision was long ago made for me. And so I did not revisit it in rehab because I was not something I could believe in. So yeah.
Yeah, because I connect when I started my recovery pathway, the group was my higher power because I didn't know if I was an agnostic or an atheist. But then I really focused and pursued spirituality in all forms to come to the place of what my faith means to me today. So I was just curious about that.
Well, the other side is it's not just the belief in the higher power, right? It's to turn your will and your life over. I mean, so even if I could have found a higher power, like some people, and look, I have nothing but respect for 12 steps when it works for people. But they told me things like, well, it can be a doorknob. It's like, really, I want to turn my will and my life over to a doorknob? I'm not, I mean, even if it was the group, I would not have been willing to turn my will and my life over to the group. Now, this doesn't mean I thought I knew everything or that I was, some great power. It just meant that I needed to make the decisions for myself and find what was going to work. And so, but it was frightening because they just repeatedly told me that there was one in any way. And so when I got home from rehab, that's when I started doing the research to see if there were other options.
Was this the first time you had been to treatment or
Yes.
rehab? So you
Yes.
managed to go all those years without getting into treatment or rehab. So how did you even know to go?
Well, let me tell you, I remember in rehab, my roommate, the first day she said to me, she was giving me the schedule, and I was looking at it like clearly I had never seen one before. She goes, "Is this your first rehab?" And I said with kind of pride, "Yeah, I never even tried to stop." Like this was a positive thing, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I knew rehabs existed. When I wanted to go to one, I didn't know how to find one, and so I went to an NA meeting and asked, and they told me, well, we don't waive referrals because I didn't know that. When somebody gave me one name, and then I would call, and they would not have spots, or they wouldn't take me for some reason. There was a big emphasis on dual addiction at the time. I think it's where some of the money was coming from. And I had only done meth for years. I wasn't doing, well, occasionally I would do heroin or something, but most, 99.9% meth. And they kept asking me, what other drugs are you doing? And I'd say no. And they'd say, well, we don't have a spot for you. So finally I lied. I lied to get rehab. And I said, I'm doing alcohol too. And so I finally got in. And then because I didn't have insurance and it was a low cost program, I had to wait 10 weeks. I had to call on Monday, I forget, between 9 and noon or something for 10 weeks to hold my spot as I worked my way up the list. And I was very proud that I managed to do that, So I had really some motivation to, to get in there.
Yeah, I always worry about missing those magic moments when somebody has the motivation and not being able to find the resource. So
you have a lot of energy, Mary Beth. So anything else you want to talk about your treatment episode?
Well, I will say that I actually I used twice when I was in rehab and once when I got home. And, but that was, of course, way better. And, so that was good. And then when I got home, I started looking for other program options to see if I could find them.
And what'd you find?
So I like to emphasize it's 1994. There is no Google. Okay. So I went to the library. I went to the library and I was looking for options. And the first one that I found was Women for Sobriety, which was the first modern secular option. And I will say it was a great relief to find any other program. It was like, okay, right?
You're not the first atheist that's looking for recovery.
That's right. That's right. And also, I mean, in most of these programs, and it's not just atheists, right? People aren't comfortable with the 12 steps for multiple reasons,
right.
and I wasn't for multiple reasons. But yes, another program existed. It was a great relief. Again, I read all the materials. I went to the meetings. And then I also found Rational Recovery, which is basically now SMART. And I found SOS, Secular Organization for Sobriety, which exists in a small form, but Life Freeing Secular Recovery broke off in 95 and is the much larger survivor. So I read everything. I went to all the meetings and I continued to do the way I had started, which was I synthesized ideas that I thought would work for me. And today more people do that. It's more common and it's got different names, hybrid or patchwork or other names. But at the time I didn't know anyone who did it. So I did what I thought would work for me.
Well, I had a question, but then I lost it. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So are you working during this time? Are you able to have some stability in your life?
So I like to use this as an example of that incremental progress thing. So when I got home, luckily my partner agreed all I needed to work was part-time because remember, I'm 32. And for me to get out every day and get showered and ready and go to work on time and stay the whole time and not leave early or, and do a good job and go back the next day and the next and the next. I had never done it in my life and I was 32. So my first job was a part-time, temporary, low-level admin job because I really felt like that's all I could handle. And it also let me go to more meetings to do recovery things, right? And then my second job was a mid-level permanent admin job. And then my third job was a supervisory job at a bigger company, and I got a promotion. And then at 6.5 years sober, I went back to law school. I had to start over because, I hadn't really done it the first time. So I went to law school again at 6.5 years sober, which was, it was a joy, to have regained something that important that I had lost because of my addiction.
Were there barriers to being able to go back?
I mean, I had to start it. First of all, it had been 16 years since I had gone the first time. It's a very, very long time. So I had to take the law school admission test like everybody else. I was really nervous about trying to explain what had happened the last time, but I didn't say drugs. I just said health issues and financial issues. That's what I said when I was true, which was true. It was more vague, but it was true. And so Berkeley didn't let me back at first. They didn't let me back in. I ended up going to Hastings in San Francisco, which is a good law school, but it's not a top 10 law school. But I was number 3 in my class at Hastings, and then Berkeley took me back. And so I was able to end up graduating from Berkeley Law, which was, a very, very happy accomplishment for me.
Redemptive.
So you talked a lot, too, about the trauma and healing from trauma. And I can tell that you've done a lot of work just the way you talk about it. What did that look like for you?
It actually took me a lot longer to get my trauma under control, my trauma damage, than my substance use disorder. I started pretty early in when I got home. So when I got home, every day of the week I did something. My husband and I were in couples counseling, and then I was in individual counseling, and then I was doing 5 meetings a week. So I did individual therapy for, I think, 3 years, and then I went into a group for women with a trauma history. And oh my God, that was such a revealing experience for me. I always remembered the big events, and I was aware of the big reactions that I had, like using drugs or like God forbid somebody come from behind, and I can't see them, I would jump or yell. I punched a guy once at the gym because he came up behind me. But with those women, they made me much more aware of all the nuances of the trauma reaction. They would talk about behaviors or ways of thinking that I thought were just who I was or normal. And they were talking about it and connecting it to the trauma. And I was like, oh my God, that is a trauma reaction. Like, I really catastrophized. Even though I was always pushing to the next step, moving myself forward, I really wasn't enjoying it because I was always worried that one little mistake and it's all going to explode in my face. I didn't have any trust that things would work out. My husband used to call me the what about tomorrow girl, about how good things were. I was always worried about tomorrow. And when I went into this group of women, they really helped me see that my thinking was disproportionate to reality, and that it helped me start to move forward at another level. It helped me heal at a new level. And then I did do medication for several years as well to help me with my anxiety. So once in the beginning, I didn't even know I had PTSD. Once I learned that, and then I just moved individual, group, meds. But even today, I still say I'm mostly recovered from the trauma because it does have ripples, but the anxiety is a lot less frequent and it's a lot less severe and it lasts for a lot less time. So it's not completely gone, but it's, 95% better. And I probably am close to like the average range now. Probably not in it, but I'm probably close to it. So it was a real process. Getting all of that under control was a real long process. But long, but incrementally better, right? It's not a light switch. It's not 10 years and boom, it's better. It's better. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit, we were recently talking about grief, and grief isn't a process you walk through and get to the other side. You learn to walk with it. And I like that analogy too for trauma healing in a lot of ways, is that you don't ever get all the way through it, but you can walk with it and live with it.
Yes.
And the other part that I find fascinating too is that you're a judge, right? And so you're a judge and you're talking like this, like shooting Beth and being in rehab and all of that. Judges aren't supposed to talk like that, are they? So talk a little bit about how you got to be a judge and your willingness to put your face on your recovery now.
Well, so I went to law school and I had 6.5 years sober, and then I worked at a big law firm, and then I did class action work for the federal government, and then I was appointed a federal administrative law judge. And so it's not the kind of judge that you go to Congress and you have to, be cross-examined. It's like a testing process, they test you, cut, and some people make it through. And so I got that in 2014 when I had 20 years sober. I was appointed when I had 20 years of sobriety. And I do like to emphasize, I never had a goal of becoming a judge. It was really about what's the next right step or what's my next job, and I move forward inch by inch. But I retired in January of 2020 from that job for multiple reasons. And so I had told them that I was in recovery because I joined the board of Life-Ring Secular Recovery, and I had to disclose it as an ethics thing. And so I had to write up a little memo about what I was going to do for Life-Ring. And I said something, I think I had 23 years or something of sobriety. And I said, I have, 23 years and here's what I'm going to do. But I didn't say to what drug or anything. And I'm guessing they assumed alcohol, but they didn't ask. And why should it matter? I had 23 years of sobriety at that point, right? And so once I retired, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in August of 2020. And that was the first time I went 100% public, like open. I mean, I was public in that I was on the Life-Ring board member list and that kind of thing. But in the Wall Street Journal in August of 2020, I had an op-ed, I Beat Addiction Without God. And in there, I announced that I was a former meth addict and a former judge. And people weren't happy about it. They really, again, it's that stigma thing, right? Somebody who had that history shouldn't be allowed to be a judge. Like, it should disqualify me, which it's ridiculous. I had 20 years of sobriety at the time that I became a judge. And then I had an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer where I talked about being shooting meth, that was a former IV meth addict. And then I recently had an op-ed in the LA Times where I talked about my arrest. And so pretty much I'm about as public as you can get at this book, plus the book, which is much more detailed. But the judge thing, it helps me get interest so that I can talk about multiple paths to recovery, and also to stand up and say, I was an IV meth addict and I became a judge. In other words, nothing is impossible in recovery. We don't know what these people that are suffering could be, what their life could be like. Because the reality is, being a judge is not the most important part of my recovery. It was my job, right? It was my job. But it's a job that has a certain positive social resonance. And so I can put it up against having been an IV meth addict and hopefully open some eyes about what's possible in recovery, and to not really stigmatize people that are struggling with substance use disorders.
So what do some of the haters say about you?
Basically that nobody who ever shot meth should be allowed to be a judge, that, and also they didn't like that I was an atheist, right? Atheists also should not be allowed to be judges, apparently. So there's that. But it was really just that they didn't like that connection. I think if I would have been alcohol, I don't know, I would have gotten the same reaction, but right? Meth. But because it was meth, that's the reaction that I got. That I must have, lied to get the job. I must have hidden things. And look, I didn't announce my past, but I answered all the questions accurately that I was asked. The truth is, when you get hired, they don't want to know, did you use drugs 20 years ago? They want to know what you do in the last 7 years. Do you have a current problem? Well, I had 20 years, people, 20 years. Yeah. It wasn't relevant, and they didn't ask.
You're making me think of like all the shows and movies that I watch where they portray the bad judge who allows themselves to be bribed or to have sexual improprieties. So, we can portray all that, but I don't think I've ever seen a judge portrayed as a junkie. So thank you for putting your face on recovery and the possibilities that recovery brings.
Thank you. I mean, that is the goal, right? That is the main goal, and to reduce the stigma around it. It's a medical condition. It's a health condition. If people can recover and they can live vibrant lives professionally, and even more important, personally.
So here's your opportunity to talk about your book. I'm curious as why you wrote it and how long it took you to write it, and where can people get it?
So when I was appointed a judge, it was really a time of reflection, right? How did I do this? It's kind of amazing. How did I do it? And so I started taking notes around it. I actually had the title. I think I got the domain names 5 or 6 years ago. I got them early because I wanted to make sure no one snuck in there and stole them from me. And I started taking notes, and then I started organizing the book. But I was a new judge, and it was a side project. Plus, I had never written a book, so I had to figure out what does a memoir look like? What are the features of a memoir and aspects? I had to learn how to write, and so it was kind of a nice intellectual exercise on the side. But it was a time to revisit my past, to really think about where I came from, and how I ended up where I ended up, and then what was the purpose was a question that I asked myself. What's the purpose? And so after reading memoir and recovery space, I felt like a lot of memoirs, they jump to the craziness of the using, right? I really wanted to show what led up to it. Why 12-year-old Mary Beth thought picking up alcohol and other drugs was a good idea. What made that appealing? And so I do include my history up until that point. And then also I felt like a lot of memoirs, they end with, I went to a couple meetings and everything was great. Well, that's not how recovery works. And so, and in particular, because I did it, my recovery in a more unusual way, I felt like it was important to show it. So I go through the first 3 years of how I built my substance use recovery and also address the trauma recovery, not for people to follow exactly what I did, because what works for them and what works for me may be different, but just as an example, Here's what I thought about. Here's how I put it together. Here's how I mixed programs. Here's how I pulled ideas. And here's how I started to address the trauma. So I wanted that whole arc. So it really sort of goes from birth until 3 years into my recovery. And it's called From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And you can order it on Amazon and all the usual sites. And your bookstores can get it for you as well.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add that we haven't covered?
I mean, the only thing I'll say is, I'm on Twitter at MaryBethO_. Follow me. But also, if anyone wants to reach out to me for any reason, you can message me through my website or marybeth@junkietoJudge.com. I answer all messages. I'm always happy to respond.
I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Mary Beth. I hope you did too.
I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
And best luck with the book. I can't wait to get it myself. I'm interested in it very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.